The human engineer. Lieutenant James Sullivan stood before the airlock of Centauri Deep Space Station, his weathered duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Through the reinforced viewport, he could see the welcoming committee, if you could call it that. The assembled group of alien station personnel huddled together, their body language screaming discomfort even across species barriers. The station's atmospheric processors hummed to life, adjusting the air mixture to accommodate human physiology. Sullivan watched the status light cycle from red to green, fighting back a smile as he noticed several of the aliens flinch at each mechanical click and whir. Their reaction wasn't surprising. Everything about humans seemed to make other species nervous. The airlock cycled open with a soft hiss. Sullivan stepped through, his heavy boots making a dull thud against the deck plating. The sound echoed through the suddenly silent reception area. A tall, silvery being with 4 arms and iridescent scales, clearly the senior officer, stepped forward. Lieutenant Sullivan. The alien's translator rendered their complex harmonics into standard galactic English. I am Station Director Vixterra. Your arrival is unexpected. The pause spoke volumes. Sullivan maintained his professional demeanor, though he couldn't help but notice how the director's scales rippled with what he assumed was anxiety. Thank you for having me, Director. The Galactic Engineering Corps said you needed a quantum drive specialist. That's me. A shorter reptilian creature clutching a datapad stepped forward, their tail twitching nervously. But you're a Deathworlder, they managed to say, their translator struggling to maintain neutral tones. Chief Engineer Scuttle, Director Vixterra introduced, shooting their subordinate a warning glance. They have concerns about your biological compatibility with our safety protocols. Sullivan had expected this. Earth's classification as a death world by galactic standards meant that most species viewed humans as walking disaster zones. The fact that humans could survive radiation levels that would kill most sentient species, process toxins that would dissolve others, and endure pressure changes that would rupture standard environmental suits made them simultaneously fascinating and terrifying to the galactic community. I've reviewed all safety protocols, Sullivan replied calmly, pulling out his own datapad. My environmental impact assessment is right here, along with my certification for all standard and experimental dry systems. He transmitted the documents with a quick gesture. The assembled aliens watched the data transfer as if expecting the mere proximity of human-handled information to corrupt their systems. When nothing catastrophic happened, Director Vixterra's scales settled into a slightly less agitated pattern. Your credentials are impressive, they admitted, examining the files. But our quantum drive is experimental. The energies involved are roughly equivalent to standing in direct sunlight on Earth for an hour, Sullivan finished. I checked the specs. Trust me, I've worked with much more volatile systems. This statement, meant to be reassuring, caused several of the junior engineers to emit high-pitched trilling sounds that their translators didn't even attempt to interpret. Chief Engineer Scuttle's tail went completely rigid. You've worked with more volatile. They began, before Director Vixterra raised all 4 hands in a calming gesture. Perhaps we should show Lieutenant Sullivan to his quarters first, the director suggested diplomatically. The station's environmental systems have been modified to accommodate your unique requirements. Sullivan followed the group through the station's corridors, noting how other crew members quickly found reasons to be elsewhere as they passed. The station itself was beautiful, a triumph of galactic engineering. Quantum-stabilized alloys formed graceful arches overhead, while gravity plating so precise it could simulate any world's pull hummed beneath their feet. His quarters, when they reached them, were clearly designed with catastrophic containment in mind. Triple-sealed doors, independent atmospheric processing, and enough radiation shielding to survive a solar flare. Sullivan didn't mention that he'd slept in far worse conditions during his training. The Quantum Drive Control Center is on Level 7, Chief Engineer Scuttle explained, keeping a careful distance. All critical systems are monitored from there. We've adapted the control interfaces for human use. Reinforced them, you mean? Sullivan said good-naturedly. When the alien stared at him in shock, he added, "It's okay. I know humans have a reputation for breaking things, but that's exactly why we're also good at fixing them." Director Vixtera's scales shifted through several colors before settling on a muted purple. "Your assignment here is experimental, Lieutenant. The Galactic Engineering Corps believes that human adaptability might be beneficial to our research, but I must emphasize the need for caution. Our quantum drive technology is delicate." Sullivan nodded, unpacking his tools, each one certified safe for use around sensitive equipment, though the certification process had probably involved more testing than the tools themselves. "I understand, Director. I'm here to help, not to cause problems." As the welcoming committee filed out, making various gestures that probably warded against disaster in their respective cultures, Sullivan caught fragments of their worried conversations through the closing door. Like having a natural disaster on staff. Heard they drink molecular acid for pleasure. Can survive in open space for minutes. What if it sneezes near the quantum matrices? Sullivan shook his head, smiling slightly as he organized his workspace. He'd encountered these reactions before, but something told him this assignment would be different. The Centauri Deep Space Station was pushing the boundaries of known physics with their experimental drive, and sooner or later, they'd need someone who could think outside the box, someone whose very existence defied their understanding of what was possible. He just hoped they'd be ready when that moment came. Looking out his viewport at the vast expanse of space, Sullivan watched the quantum drive's energy signature pulse through the station's superstructure like bioluminescence through deep-sea creatures on Earth. Beautiful, mysterious, and potentially deadly, just the way he liked it. Tomorrow, he'd begin his real work. Tonight, he'd let them worry. After all, sometimes a little healthy fear of the impossible was exactly what you needed to achieve it. Warning signs. 3 weeks into his assignment, Lieutenant Sullivan crouched inside a maintenance shaft, watching streams of quantum particles dance through the transparent conduits above his head. The sight never ceased to amaze him. Like aurora borealis caught in glass, channeling enough energy to power a small planet. His handheld analyzer beeped softly, confirming what his instincts had already told him. Something wasn't right. "Are you detecting the anomaly as well?" Chief Engineer Scuttle's voice crackled through his comm unit. The reptilian alien had gradually grown less nervous around Sullivan, though they still maintained what they considered a safe distance during direct interactions. "Yeah," Sullivan responded, tapping commands into his analyzer. "The quantum flux is showing micro-fluctuations. Nothing dangerous yet, but the pattern's not normal." He placed one hand directly on the conduit housing, feeling the subtle vibrations. The gesture made Skittle's tail twitch violently on the monitoring screen. "Lieutenant, the radiation levels in that section are well within my tolerance range," Sullivan finished, having had this conversation several times before. "And sometimes you need to feel the machinery to understand what it's telling you." A new voice joined the conversation. "Fascinating. You can detect quantum variations through tactile input." It was Dr. Ryleth, the station's theoretical physicist. Unlike most of the crew, they seemed more intrigued than terrified by human capabilities. Sullivan smiled. "Not exactly. But every piece of technology has its own rhythm, its own way of speaking. Right now, this one's telling me it's got hiccups." Hiccups. Several voices asked simultaneously, their translators struggling with the concept. "Sorry." Human expression. Small interruptions in normal function. Sullivan crawled deeper into the maintenance shaft, following the quantum conduit's path. "The question is, why?" The answer came 3 junctions later. Sullivan's light illuminated a section of the conduit where the quantum stream briefly flickered, like a candle in a draft that shouldn't exist. He magnified the image on his visor display. "Well, that's interesting," he muttered. "Define interesting." Director Vixtera's voice joined the channel, their tone suggesting they'd learned to dread human definitions of that word. The quantum stream is experiencing localized temporal displacement, Sullivan explained, running more detailed scans. Tiny moments where the particles exist slightly out of sync with normal spacetime. There was a long pause before Dr. Rylith spoke again. That should be impossible with our containment systems. Impossible is a funny word, Sullivan replied, pulling tools from his belt. On Earth, we used to think it was impossible for anything to survive in volcanic vents at the bottom of our oceans. Turned out we just weren't looking at it the right way. He could practically hear the aliens exchanging worried glances through the calm silence. Since his arrival, they'd learned that human analogies often preceded unorthodox solutions to problems. Lieutenant Sullivan. Director Vixtera said carefully, "Whatever you're planning." "Don't worry," Sullivan interrupted, already calibrating his equipment. "I'm just going to give the quantum stream a gentle nudge. Sometimes these particles just need a reminder about which timeline they're supposed to be in." A nudge. Chief Skittles' tail was probably tied in knots by now. The quantum stream is not some primitive mechanical system that you can simply. Sullivan activated his device. A precise pulse of energy rippled through the conduit, causing the quantum stream to briefly flare brilliant green before settling back into its normal blue-white flow. The fluctuation smoothed out immediately. "There we go," Sullivan said, satisfaction. "Like burping a baby." "Like what?" multiple voices asked. "Never mind. The point is, the temporal displacement has been corrected, though we should probably investigate why it happened in the first place." Sullivan began backing out of the maintenance shaft, his mind already working on the puzzle. Back in the control center, the alien crew stared at readings that showed the quantum drive operating more efficiently than ever. Director Vixtera's scales had shifted to a color Sullivan hadn't seen before. "Your method was unconventional," they said finally. "But effective," Dr. Rylith added, their multiple eyes fixed on the quantum stream display. "Though I admit, the theoretical principles behind your solution escape me." Sullivan began cleaning his tools, a habit ingrained from years of service. Sometimes the best solution isn't the most theoretically sound. Humans learned that lesson early. We had to. Our whole planet is one big exercise in adapting to the impossible. "Yes," Chief Skittle said, their tail finally beginning to relax. "We've studied your world's environmental extremes. The temperature variations alone would kill most species. And yet you not only survived but thrived," Dr. Rylith observed. "Perhaps that's why the quantum stream responded to your nudge. Here both examples of possibility defying theoretical limits." Sullivan was about to respond when a new alarm caught everyone's attention. The quantum stream's color had shifted slightly, taking on a purple tinge that none of them had seen before. "That's new," Sullivan remarked, already reaching for his analyzer. "New is not good," Director Vixtera stated firmly. "New means unknown variables. Unknown variables in quantum mechanics are just problems we haven't solved yet." Sullivan finished, studying the readings. His expression grew serious as the data scrolled across his display. "Though in this case, I think we might want to solve it quickly." The aliens gathered around his display, their various anatomical features registering different levels of concern as they processed the information. "The temporal displacement," Dr. Rylith whispered. "It's spreading." Sullivan nodded grimly. "And it's accelerating. Whatever's happening in there, it's not hiccups anymore." He straightened up, switching his analyzer to continuous monitoring mode. "I think it's time we had a serious talk about what this experimental drive of yours is really designed to do." The aliens exchanged looks that transcended species barriers, the universal expression of people holding secrets they'd hoped would never come to light. Director Vixtera's scales settled into a deep, troubled blue. "Perhaps you're right, Lieutenant. But I warn you, the truth behind this project may challenge even your species' famous adaptability." "Director," Sullivan replied with a slight smile, "challenging the impossible is practically humanity's job description." As if to emphasize his words, another alarm began to sound, this one deeper, more urgent. The quantum stream's purple tinge was spreading, and with it, the fabric of space-time itself was beginning to whisper warnings that none of them could afford to ignore. The real test was about to begin. The coming storm. The Quantum Drive Control Center had never been so crowded. Director Vixtera's scales shifted between anxious colors as they addressed the assembled crew, while Dr. Rayleth's multiple eyes blinked in rapid succession, a sign of extreme stress in their species. Lieutenant Sullivan stood quietly, absorbing the revelation that had just been shared. "Let me get this straight," Sullivan said finally, breaking the tense silence. "This isn't just a propulsion system. You're trying to create a controlled temporal fold, a way to peek into parallel timelines. The theoretical applications are extraordinary," Dr. Rayleth explained, their translator struggling to convey their excitement even through their obvious concern. "Imagine being able to observe alternative quantum states without collapsing the wave function. Imagine the catastrophic consequences if containment fails," Chief Skittle countered, their tail lashing anxiously. "The temporal displacement is growing exponentially. We're detecting quantum echoes from at least 7 parallel timelines now." Sullivan moved to the main control panel, studying the increasingly complex patterns in the quantum stream. The purple tinge had deepened, and strange shadows seemed to move within it, like seeing multiple exposure photographs overlaid on each other, each showing a slightly different reality. "Why didn't you tell me this from the start?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Director Vixtera's scales rippled. "The Galactic Science Council classified this research at the highest levels. We were instructed to maintain absolute secrecy, even from our maintenance specialists. However, they gestured at the alarming readings on every screen." "Circumstances have changed. That's putting it mildly," Sullivan muttered, his analyzer beeping warnings about increasing temporal instability. "The quantum stream isn't just peeking at other timelines anymore. It's trying to merge them." A horrified trill went through the alien crew. Dr. Rayleth rushed to verify Sullivan's assessment, their appendages flying over multiple control surfaces simultaneously. "He's right," they confirmed, their voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "The temporal boundaries are beginning to blur. If this continues, reality itself could shatter," Sullivan finished, already running calculations in his head. Like a mirror breaking into infinite reflections, each one showing a different version of now. "We must shut down the drive immediately," Chief Skittle declared, moving toward the emergency protocols panel. "Wait." Sullivan's sharp command froze everyone in place. "A sudden shutdown could trigger exactly what we're trying to prevent. Think of it like a dam about to break. You don't just throw up a solid wall and hope it holds." "Then what do you suggest?" Director Vixtera demanded, their scales now a deep, troubled violet. "Our containment systems are already at maximum capacity." Sullivan's mind raced, drawing on everything he knew about quantum mechanics, temporal theory, and good old-fashioned human ingenuity. "We need to give the timeline streams somewhere to go. A controlled release point." "Impossible," Dr. Rayleth objected. "The energy involved would." A deep rumble cut through their protest as the station shuddered. Warning lights flashed across every console as the quantum stream's purple color suddenly blazed brighter. "Timeline collapse accelerating," Chief Skittle reported, their tail now rigid with terror. "Multiple system failures imminent. Begin evacuation procedures," Director Vixtera ordered, their voice steady despite their wildly shifting scales. "All non-essential personnel to escape pods immediately." Sullivan barely heard the evacuation order. He was staring at the quantum stream, watching the shadow realities dance within it. Something about the pattern. "Lieutenant," the director's voice snapped him back to the present. "You must evacuate as well. The radiation levels alone are about to be the least of our problems." Sullivan interrupted, his analyzer displaying readings that made his blood run cold. "The temporal fold isn't just affecting the station anymore. It's expanding into normal space." The implications hit everyone at once. If the temporal collapse continued unchecked, It wouldn't just destroy the station. It could create a cascade effect that would tear apart the fabric of space-time itself, potentially affecting entire star systems. How long? Dr. Rayleigh asked quietly. Sullivan checked his calculations twice, hoping he was wrong. At the current rate of expansion, maybe 30 minutes before the effect becomes irreversible. Director Vixtera's scales went completely gray, a color Sullivan had never seen before. The nearest response vessel is 3 hours away. Even if we evacuate now, we can't outrun it, Sullivan finished. He turned to face the assembled crew, his expression hardening into the determination that had carried humanity through countless impossible situations. But I might be able to stop it. How? Chief Scuttle demanded. The containment systems are failing, the temporal fold is collapsing, and the radiation levels in the drive chamber are beyond lethal. Sullivan smiled grimly. Beyond lethal for most species, you mean? He began pulling tools from his belt, quickly modifying them for what he had in mind. Humans don't just survive on a death world, Chief. We learn to dance with destruction. And right now, we need to teach these timelines a new dance. Whatever you're planning, Director Vixtera said, reading something in his expression that alarmed them. It's extremely dangerous. Of course it is, Sullivan replied, finishing his preparations. But sometimes the only way to fix the impossible is to do something equally impossible. He turned to Dr. Rayleigh. I'm going to need direct access to the quantum drive's core chamber. The alien physicist's eyes all widened simultaneously. The radiation levels in there are beyond anything even a human could survive. Probably, Sullivan agreed, checking his modified equipment one last time. But right now, I'm the only chance we've got. Besides, he added with a ghost of a smile, if this works, maybe somewhere in one of those parallel timelines, there's a version of me that doesn't have to do this at all. Before anyone could stop him, he was moving toward the core chamber access, his mind already racing with the calculations and adjustments he'd need to make. Behind him, he heard Director Vixtera giving rapid orders, preparing for either salvation or catastrophe. The quantum stream pulsed in even deeper purple, and reality itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what this impossible creature from a death world would do next. Against all odds, the core chamber's massive doors sealed behind Sullivan with a sound like thunder. Through his reinforced visor, he could see the quantum drive's heart, a swirling maelstrom of purple-tinged energy that seemed to exist in multiple places at once. His radiation detector was screaming warnings, but he ignored it. The numbers didn't matter anymore. Only the next few minutes did. Lieutenant, your vital signs are already showing significant stress. Dr. Rayleigh's voice crackled through his comm. The temporal radiation is affecting your cellular structure. Sullivan moved forward, each step deliberate in the heavy maintenance suit he'd modify for this impossible task. Tell me something I don't know, Doc. Like what exactly this drive was supposed to do before it started tearing reality apart. There was a pause before Director Vixtera answered. The quantum fold was designed to allow us to observe alternate timelines, to study roads not taken. The goal was to learn from choices we never made. Noble idea, Sullivan grunted, reaching the first set of quantum conduits. But you forgot something important about parallel timelines. His hands moved quickly, rerouting power flows and adjusting containment fields. They're parallel for a reason. They're not supposed to meet. The containment systems should have prevented any intersection, Chief Scuttle protested. The theoretical modals. Theory's great, Sullivan interrupted, wincing as another wave of temporal radiation washed over him. But reality's messy, kind of like Earth's weather. You can predict it all you want, but sometimes a hurricane shows up anyway. He reached the main control junction, where dozens of quantum streams converged into a single point of impossible light. The purple glow was almost blinding now, and through it, he could see other versions of himself. Some wearing different uniforms, some in civilian clothes, some. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus on this reality, this moment. Timeline collapse accelerating, Dr. Relith reported, their voice tight with tension. Whatever you're planning, Lieutenant, it needs to happen now. Sullivan pulled out his modified tools, trying to ignore the way his hands were starting to shimmer slightly, as if they existed in multiple places at once. Remember how I said these timelines need somewhere to go? I'm going to give them one. But I need you to shut down every safety protocol in the containment system. That would release the temporal energy directly into the core chamber. Chief Scattle's tail could be heard whipping against console panels in agitation. Exactly, Sullivan said, already working on the quantum stream controls. Sometimes the only way to stop a flood is to open all the gates at once. Director Vixterra's scales must have been cycling through every possible color. The energy release would be catastrophic. Even if your plan works, the radiation exposure would kill any normal species instantly, Sullivan finished. Good thing I'm from a Deathworld, huh? He allowed himself a grim smile. Did you know humans are the only known species that actively seeks out radiation for medical purposes? We call it radiation therapy. Sometimes you have to embrace the thing that could kill you to survive. The quantum streams were pulsing faster now, the purple light taking on a dangerous intensity. Sullivan could feel the temporal radiation trying to pull him in multiple directions at once, as if each alternate timeline was trying to claim him for its own. Initiating safety protocol override, he announced, his fingers dancing across the controls. On my mark, I need you to divert all power to the central containment field. But that would. Trust me, Sullivan interrupted. If there's one thing humans understand, it's controlled chaos. The aliens fell silent, watching their displays as Sullivan began the final sequence. The quantum drive's hum rose to a pitch that made the entire station vibrate. Now, Sullivan shouted, throwing the last switch. The world exploded in purple light. Reality itself seemed to scream as multiple timelines crashed together in the core chamber. Sullivan stood at the center of the maelstrom, using his modified tools to shape the temporal energy like a blacksmith shaping white-hot metal. Quantum streams are realigning. Dr. Ryleth's voice was filled with disbelief. The temporal signatures are synchronizing. Sullivan could barely hear them over the roar of reality reshaping itself. He pushed harder, forcing the timelines into a new configuration. Like braiding rope, he gasped through gritted teeth. You don't fight the strands, you guide them. His consciousness started to fragment, showing him glimpses of other lives, other choices. In one timeline, he was a civilian engineer. In another, he had never left Earth. In yet another, he forced the visions away, concentrating on this moment, this reality. Sullivan's vision was starting to blur, his cells screaming from radiation exposure that would have vaporized most beings instantly. But he could see it working. The purple glow was fading, the temporal energies settling into a new, stable pattern. Just a little more, he managed, making the final adjustments. The quantum streams flickered once, twice, and then settled into a pure, steady blue glow. The temporal fold collapsed in on itself, reality snapping back into proper alignment like a rubber band returning to shape. For a moment, perfect silence filled the core chamber. Then Sullivan's legs gave out, and he collapsed to his knees, his modified suit smoking slightly from the energy discharge. Lieutenant, multiple voices called through the comm. Your vital signs are critical. We're sending an emergency. No, Sullivan coughed, forcing himself to stand. Radiations, still too high. Give it 5 minutes to stabilize. He leaned against a console, checking the readings through his increasingly fuzzy vision. Did it work? Quantum drive is fully contained, Dr. Relith confirmed, their voice filled with awe. The temporal fold has completely collapsed. Timeline integrity is perfect. Lieutenant, you've done the impossible. Sullivan managed a weak laugh. Impossible is just another word for haven't tried hard enough yet. His legs were shaking badly now, his cells struggling to repair damage that should have been instantly fatal. Though I might need a few days off after this. Your radiation exposure levels are beyond anything in our medical database, Director Vixtera said, their tone mixing concern with disbelief. By all known science, you should be dead. Sullivan finished, still checking systems despite his condition. Yeah, we get that a lot on Earth. But humans, we're stubborn that way. Though I wouldn't say no to some medical attention once the radiation levels drop. As emergency protocols engaged and decontamination procedures began, Sullivan smiled faintly. Somewhere in the infinite possibilities they'd just prevented from colliding, there were probably versions of him who had failed or never tried at all. But in this reality, the only one that mattered right now, humanity had once again proved that the impossible was just a matter of perspective. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest parallel truth of all. Legacy. 3 weeks after what was now being called the temporal incident, Lieutenant Sullivan sat in the station's medical bay, watching the quantum drive's steady blue glow through the viewport. His skin still had a faint luminescent quality, a souvenir from his dance with multiple realities, but the station's medical team had declared his recovery miraculous, terrifying, and thoroughly human. Your cellular regeneration rates continue to defy explanation, Dr. Raylith announced, studying readings from their medical scanner with all eyes wide open. The radiation damage is not only healing, but your DNA appears to have adapted. Sullivan flexed his fingers, watching the subtle shimmer that followed the movement. Yeah, we do that. Earth's background radiation has been reshaping human DNA since we first crawled out of the oceans. We just roll with it. Director Vixtera entered the medical bay, their scales now displaying new colors that seemed to have been inspired by Sullivan's quantum exposure. The Galactic Science Council has reviewed our report on the incident. They have questions. I bet they do, Sullivan chuckled, then winced slightly. Laughing still hurt. Hard to keep a project secret after it nearly tears apart the fabric of reality. That's not what they're most interested in, the director said, their scales shifting to a thoughtful blue. They want to know how you did it. The mathematical models alone should have taken days to calculate, yet you formulated a solution in minutes. Sullivan shrugged, a gesture that had fascinated his alien colleagues since his arrival. Sometimes you don't have time for math. Sometimes you have to go with instinct. Instinct, Chief Zickel repeated, entering with their tail now decorated with radiation warning stripes, apparently a new fashion trend among their species. You faced a quantum temporal collapse that could have destroyed reality itself, and you relied on instinct. That's how we survived Earth, Sullivan explained, standing carefully. His balance was still slightly off, as if part of him existed a few microseconds out of sync with the present. Our world throws everything at us. Radiation, pressure changes, temperature extremes, gravitational variations. We learn to adapt fast or die. Mathematical models are great, but sometimes you need to improvise. Like using yourself as a quantum focal point. Dr. Raylith asked, their translator failing to hide their mix of horror and admiration. You essentially became a living containment field. Sullivan walked to the viewport, watching the station's crew go about their duties. He noticed they no longer avoided him in the corridors. If anything, they seemed to move closer when he passed, as if his presence reassured them. The Council has also revised Earth's classification, Director Vixtera announced. While it remains a Deathworld, they've added a new designation, Crucible of Innovation. They believe the environmental pressures that shaped humanity may be crucial for future technological advancement. They want to send more humans to work on complex projects. Chief Skittle added, their tail twitching with what might have been excitement rather than anxiety. Your solution to the temporal collapse has opened new possibilities in quantum engineering. Sullivan turned back to face them, his slight luminescence creating subtle patterns in the medical bay's dim lighting. And how do you feel about that? About working with more Deathworlders? The aliens exchanged glances before Dr. Raylith spoke. We've learned that what we considered limitations were really just different perspectives. Your ability to survive what should have been unsurvivable, to solve what should have been unsolvable. Their eyes blinked in sequence. Perhaps we needed a species shaped by impossible conditions to help us achieve impossible things. The Quantum Drive project will continue, Director Vixterra said, their scales showing pride. But with modifications, we'll be incorporating what we call the Sullivan principle. Sometimes the most elegant solution is the one that breaks all the rules. Sullivan laughed, ignoring the twinge of pain. Just wait until you meet some of our theoretical physicists. Breaking rules is practically a human hobby. The soft alarm chimed, and Chief Scuttle checked their datapad. The new quantum containment protocols you designed are ready for testing. Would you like to observe? Sullivan smiled, noting how the chief's tail now moved with curiosity rather than fear. Actually, I have a few ideas about improving the efficiency of the temporal sensors, if you're interested. The alien's various expressions of enthusiasm were all the answer he needed. As they left the medical bay together, discussing possibilities that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago, Sullivan reflected on humanity's journey. From a harsh world that should have killed them, to the stars that should have been beyond their reach, to this moment, teaching the galaxy that impossible was just another word for hasn't been done yet. His skin shimmed slightly in the corridor lights, a reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. But that was humanity's gift to the galaxy, the ability to stand at the edge of catastrophe and find not just survival, but innovation. Lieutenant, Director Vixterra said as they reached the Quantum Drive Control Center, the Council has one more question. When you were in the core chamber, you mentioned seeing other timelines, other versions of yourself. May I ask, were they all survivors? Sullivan paused before answering, remembering the glimpses of countless other possibilities. No, he said finally, but in every timeline where humanity existed, we were all trying. That's what makes us who we are. We don't just survive the impossible, we challenge it to do better. The quantum drive hummed softly, its blue glow now containing the faintest trace of purple, a reminder that beyond the boundaries of normal space, infinite possibilities waited to be explored. And thanks to one human's impossible solution, those possibilities would be explored not with fear, but with the determination that had carried humanity from their Deathworld to the stars. After all, impossible was just the beginning.